This is Linda Woods with WindowsToWellness.com, alternative talk radio about healing, self-help, and empowerment. Welcome to Windows to Wellness. I'm your host, Linda Woods, and I am so glad you're joining us today. Our website is WindowsToWellness.com. And today we're going to do something a little bit different, and I'm real excited about our guest today. We're going to talk about Jungian astrology and Egyptology. And our guest today is Mary Lamondo. She is a Jungian astrologer and an Egyptologist, and she has over 20 years of experience in psychology, metaphysics, and world mythologies. Mary, welcome to our show today.
Thanks, Linda, and boy, you did a great job on those tongue twisters.
Did I say that?
It's not easy to wrap your mind around that.
Jungian is spelled with a J, Jungian. That's after Carl Jung, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
And how that actually fits in with astrology is Carl Jung, unbeknownst to most people, is that he studied astrology along with alchemy, dreams, and a lot of what would be considered metaphysical things towards the midpoint of his life. So he was actually, his daughter was actually one of the most famous astrologers in Switzerland and started a school for astrology. So that's kind of where my background comes from with all that.
Did you study there?
I studied in London with the Psychological School of Astrology there. So if there are any astrologers listening, they know of Liz Green and her school. That's where I went to school in London.
You told me before we started the show that Jungian astrology is a different kind. Can you tell us about that again?
Yes, and well, it's basically Western astrology, which we all know of, but where it's a little bit different is it doesn't focus so much on fortune-telling, which, kind of modern-day astrology, that's where people want to go with it, but it goes more into a very psychological background, and we talk about mythology and actually dreams a lot. We do a lot of dream work and things. So it's kind of eclectic, but it does get very deep into core issues with people. So it's a little bit more like counseling than just going to have your palm read or something like that. So we actually have to go to school and get a degree in it now.
And how long ago did you get your degree in that?
I got that in the late 80s before I went to Egypt, so it was 1988.
Wow. Let's start at the beginning, Mary. I met you. It was at a health fair recently. Well, it was a couple years ago in Nashville. I've interviewed your husband on my show. He's a Peruvian shaman, and that was quite an experience for me. Where were you born? Where did you start out?
Well, actually, I was born in Pennsylvania, Hazleton, Pennsylvania, went on to Philadelphia where I attended undergraduate school at Temple University. That's where I kind of got a basis in Near Eastern studies. Then I moved to New York, and in New York City where I worked, that's where I became very active in astrology, and I also went to NYU and got a background in art history. I graduated from NYU in 1989. So there's kind of a little bit of back and forth in terms of traveling because I did work in the music business for a while. And I was able to do a lot of traveling, and that's how I actually was able to live in London and go to school in London for a year. So as I like to say to people, the music business was very, very good to me. So I was able to travel, and in traveling incorporate a lot of my own personal pursuits, which were always along the lines of metaphysics, and just wherever I happened to be, I'd go to the museums, go to the old bookstores, and reach out for the esoteric gold, so to speak, wherever I was. And
do you think this was because in a past life or in many past lives you were actually someone from Egypt? I know you lead tours to Egypt and also to Peru. And you must have a connection to Peru.
Well, the connections came, interestingly enough, later in my life. It wasn't something that I felt, compelled to do when I was younger. However, studying astrology led me to a lot of the myths and the ancient goddess, for lack of a better word, goddess religions of the ancient Middle East. Also studying alchemy and pretty much what's considered Western magic all comes from Egypt. And I was interested in, as a scholar and a researcher. I didn't really think about having past lives there. And then between 1989 and 1990, when I was in the music business still, I was asked to be part of a crew that was going over to Egypt to film a documentary with John Anthony West in 1989, and that's called The Mystery of the Sphinx, which actually went on to win an Emmy, and it's all about the Sphinx and how it predates recorded Egyptological history and connects it perhaps to the pre-flood Atlantean legends and all of that, so forth and so on. However, going to Egypt with that crew is what led me to have kind of a conversion experience.
What happened?
Well, the minute I saw the Sphinx, and you're in the midst of the hubble and bubble of modern-day Cairo, which actually has nothing to do with ancient Egypt. It's a modern-day, huge Middle Eastern sprawling city, and there, just in the vicinity of the Sphinx and the pyramids, I felt like I was in my place, home. It was as if I found my roots, and I thought, well, now that I'm here, I'm just going to learn all I can do. And the crew was there for about 2 months, and during that time I made the decision that I was going to come back to Egypt and study, and that's eventually what I did. My being there did bring up past life considerations and just going through all of the different nooks and crannies of your own psyche when you're in a place. It's just so spiritually rich and deep that if you spend any length of time there, you're probably going to start delving into your own past life history. It's almost like an automatic process. You can't get away from it. So when people tell me that they do chores and they're, in and out of Egypt in 7 days, I hold my breath because it's like that really isn't even enough time to close your eyes over there. But yes, and I was lucky enough to be able to spend a good deal of time there. And as a student, I enrolled at the American University in Cairo to get my Egyptology degree. And as a student there, I was given access to many places and many sites that normal tourists don't get to go. So I was able to spend a lot of quality time over the 4.5 years that I was there to just be able to sit and meditate, write, kind of on one hand take in the left brain, logical, historical Egypt, but then also, have a feeling for the right brain, intuitive, psychic perception, if you will, of what Egypt was all about.
And how old were you when you first went there?
When I first went there, I was 37 years old, and so I was older than most of the students that were in that program. And as such, the professors, a lot of them went on to become very famous archaeologists, like Kent Weeks, who's the director of KV5. He was the man who just found, about 3 years ago now, the tombs of the Ramses' sons and Valleys of the Kings. So the professors and the mentors of the programs sort of became my friends because we were more around the same age. And luckily enough, I was able to meet some very interesting and helpful Egyptian people in archaeology and also in the hierarchical structure of the way Egyptians run things over there over the years. So those contacts enabled me to actually be more privy to certain things when I did start to take people over. I never intended to do groups, but that's a whole other story. Basically, I was there for research and study.
Well, what is it about Egypt and its connection to metaphysics?
Well, and one of the interesting things about Egypt is that in the 5,000 years of recorded history that we know of, and there really isn't a civilization on the planet that spans that much of a lifespan, Egypt had many, many, many different types of, let's say, customs and different types of people coming in and out of Egypt, but the religion basically pretty much stayed the same. And I think one of the things that's so prominent in Egypt, if you go back there, is the temples and the pyramids and the structures that are still standing emanate a kind of energy. And whether you're metaphysical or not, you still feel it. I mean, it's a presence. It's just how you interpret that particular feeling. And so spiritual people go over, and it's like going into the Chartres Cathedral or going into any place that has a spiritual resonance. You're looking at bricks and mortar and sand and, you know, rubble and beautiful paintings and all of that, but there's also a feeling that's evoked because thousands and thousands of years of prayers and chanting and sacred liturgy services had taken place in some of these structures. So you do feel that, and I think that all throughout our history, as soon as people were able to go into Egypt during the time of Napoleon, they became fascinated with it because it's just so different from what we know. You know, the giant statues and the intricately carved tombs, and I mean, it's very mysterious. And when you're there, even today, you know, with all the modern throngs of people and traffic and everything, it still retains that mystery. So,
I'm sure many people have speculated and wondered how those pyramids could have been built just the way they were built and the time they were built. Am I right? Is that the question on most people's minds, that it had to be more of a spiritual event that took place or an energetic event?
Yes, that is a very basic question because it's you know, even the Greeks, when they went there, Herodotus, you know, they were just in awe of the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. And one of the things, you know, which this documentary that was done by John Anthony West, The Mystery of the Sphinx, brings out is that the Great Pyramid was never actually used as a tomb. It was more of an initiation device or a particular sacred structure, and we don't know. There's many, many, many theories of how it was built, but we're pretty sure that it wasn't built as a tomb. Now that goes against the grain of Orthodox Egyptology, and if you study archaeology in school, you know, you're taught that the pyramids are tombs. But there's many reasons, you know, if you're looking at it from an esoteric point of viewpoint, that they just weren't. And that is one of the things, if people are interested in, they can actually look into, you know, reading John Anthony West's book or checking out the video. And there's people who have actually spent years, you know, from the 1800s, 1700s on, just researching pyramidology and writing thousands of books on the subject. But to this day, no one has conclusive proof. I mean, they talk about ramps and pulleys and, you know, esoteric. People talk about sound. Perhaps they use the science of sonics. I mean, there's as many theories as there are bricks in the pyramid, probably. But we don't really know yet. And again, it's pure speculation. That's why it's the prime wonder of the world and why it won't ever be dislodged from its place. Because and also it's if you look at the geology of the actual land mass that the Giza Plateau occupies in Egypt, it's on the 33rd degree parallel of longitude, and that there's a whole theory about how the four corners of that particular structure are aligned to the four corners of the planet. There's many, many, many theories about why it is so awesome as a monument and why it carries so much energy. But all I can say is that people are interested in to do their own kind of skullduggery and looking into it, because it's a great detective story, and if they have a chance to go and see it, because you can actually go inside the Great Pyramid and you can really explore and see with your own eyes and feel it, exactly what it does, how it feels to have the human body inside that structure.
Well, when we get back from break, Mary, I would like to find out what that does feel like. And I know you lead tours there, and people listening would want to know what is the pull and why would they want to go and what kind of experience might they have there. And since you've been studying this for 20 years, I'm anxious to hear what you have to say.
Great.
My guest today is Mary Lamondo. She's a teacher, an astrologer, and an Egyptologist. Her website is www.pachaterra.com. That's PACHATERRA.com. Her phone number is 954-886-8255. 972-5891, or you can reach her by email at mlamondo@bellsouth.net. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Be sure and visit our website at www.windowstowellness.com. www.windowstowellness.com. This is Linda Woods on Windows to Wellness, and our site is windowstowellness.com. We're talking to Mary Lamondo. She is a teacher, a Jungian astrologer, and an Egyptologist, and her website is www.pachaterra.com, PACHATERRA.com. Her email is mlamondo@bellsouth.net. And Mary, before the break we were talking about just what is it like to go into these temples in Egypt. I've always thought about going, but have never really been compelled to go. But maybe I'm doing this interview because somebody's trying to tell me something.
Well, you never know. And the stars are always with us on that particular subject. One of the things about Egypt, which, again, I never really thought about taking people to Egypt. It kind of evolved because once I came back to the United States, I had people ask me, and they said, we really want to go, and we want to go with someone who knows, can you take us? And really how that happened is that when I was in school and when I was able to do research with some of the best archaeologists in the world in Egypt, I got to become very acquainted with the sites themselves. And each site in Egypt, and we're talking about the length and breadth of Egypt, not just the Giza Plateau with the pyramids and the Sphinx, but the temples along the Nile. The Nile is a really gorgeous, beautiful place, and it's very magnetic as well as mysterious, because when you go to Upper Egypt, which is the southern part of the Nile, it looks like you're going back in time. You could be back in the time of Moses or the Bible, the swaying palm trees and the beautiful feluccas on the Nile, and people live a very simple life there. So it's as if you are going back in time. So anyone who feels as if they have a spiritual connection or they've had a past life, usually Upper Egypt opens up a lot of the psychic centers for people. Now, I take people into the temples along the Nile, and we kind of follow the flow of the Nile, which is, I call it the chakras along the Nile, as many people who do metaphysical work there do. And we kind of start at the bottom of the spine, which is Upper Egypt. And each temple, the Egyptian mystery schools taught that each temple was aligned to a particular star or a planet or something that they were working with cosmologically to open up and enhance the initiate's consciousness. And that's how I follow the route along the Nile. So without telling people what to expect or kind of giving them a rule book to follow, I just lend them the experience and kind of facilitate that. And usually people come up with their own experiences. Now, Egypt had what we call the Netters, N-E-T-E-R-S, which is another name for gods and goddesses. It's kind of like a numinous divine quality. And each one of those temples has a particular Netter or god or goddess, such as Isis or Horus or Osiris, that you become familiar with once you're in the flow of, being in Egypt and learning more about it. That's basically what I teach when I do the Egyptology classes. But having said that, each experience is different. As you said, you may not resonate with a particular time period of Egypt, but yet you're in a temple that has 1,000 years difference between the one that you were just in, and suddenly this one is the one that's ringing your bells and really, bringing up your energy. So it's a very individual process over there. And indeed, it does help to be, familiar with psychology as well as past life regression therapy and all of those other good things. Usually, my trips always have a good share of Reiki people on them, or people who are all working somehow in the healing modalities, because usually people in those fields are very open to, receiving the experiences that Egypt presents. But having said that, I've done tours where people come and they're just really happy and they're doing historical archaeology, and having fun and being tourists. So,
well, when you go, are you allowed to explore on your own, or do you go through as a group?
Well, we do go through as a group, and what I do is I'm able to obtain special permission for certain places. So we do have private time in the Great Pyramid if people do want to do that. And that's kind of the high point. That's the crown chakra, so to speak, of moving through the energy centers of Egypt. And so I try to leave that for the very end of the trip so that people can really experience the opening of the Kundalini, so to speak, or just working with different energies as we progress through the temple. And it is a gradual progression.
Well, can you talk about that, what that's like? What was it like for you?
Well, I can talk about what it was like for me, definitely. And because, again, I was very open to it, and I was also studying, so I was able to have a lot of time to filter and process things. Inside the Great Pyramid, the first time I do remember going in, it was very, very, I didn't go in as a private person. I went in as part of, just the regular people going up and down the pyramid. But even so, with like throngs of Japanese tourists around me and people snapping pictures, and because this was back in 1989, I felt like I was in a very, very, very ancient, sacred place that not only connected to the earth, but connected to something far greater, like a universal consciousness, connected to the stars, and sound became I started to hear things that weren't there, and a lot of people...
You said what? You could hear things? What
I could hear things, and I've talked to different people who've been there at different points in time, and it's kind of like it's like a hologram. It's just something exists there. There's an energy that exists there, and you kind of step into it, and a lot of it has to do with sound. Very strong sound frequencies inside the Great Pyramid, and people who have channeled and begun to channel, not a lot of, but at least a few people that I know have started to get information after having been inside the King's Chamber. Personal information, channeled information, just a kind of knowingness opens up. That, you could say, is that they're tapping into their own past life memories, which is, 99.9 to 100% possible, as well as tapping into a very elevated state of consciousness, like this energetic hologram that the Egyptians knew had a place in there. And this is something that if you were initiated, you would go in and you would partake of, and there were certain ceremonies and certain rituals around that.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any stories you can tell of people whose lives changed when they went on one of your tours?
Well, I don't know if there's life. My life certainly changed after having been there. And one of the things I think that happens is it's about how much you open up to that experience. I've had people on my trips who've stayed there and gotten married. Their heart becomes so open that they've actually fallen in love and found their soulmate there.
Wow.
I've had 2 or 3 experiences of that. I've had people who open up and channel and become very psychic in their own right, and then go on to write books and kind of do their own thing. Mm-hmm. I've taken many musicians there because, as I said, I used to be in the music business. I wasn't a musician. I worked in the recording industry field. But I've taken musicians into the King's Chamber where they actually were able to play and kind of incorporate their own sound and toning and, their feelings, then go into their music. And it's changed their music ever after. They've kind of...
So you're allowed to play music, your own music inside?
Only by special permission.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Normally, a group has to get permission from the Egyptian Antiquities Authority, and you can block an hour of time. And that's given through great, red tape and, lots of hoops that you have to jump through. But you can do it if it's requested. There are very few people who actually... you can't really go in. Like Paul Horn, I think back in the 80s, went in and recorded an entire album, Paul Horn inside the Great Pyramid, like Paul Horn inside the Taj Mahal. You can't do that anymore. Mm-hmm. They just won't allow it. The Egyptian authorities have gotten very protective of the Egyptian antiquities, and rightly so, because there's so many more tourists now than there used to be, and there's so many more, kind of dangers that could befall people, just in terms of having too many people in a site and, overcrowding and people fainting from heat and all kinds of things could happen. So what they do now is they really protect the sites, and they have a certain amount of people each day that are allowed inside the Great Pyramid, and then that's it.
Okay.
You buy your ticket for the next day. But
you never can spend the night there.
No, those days are actually over also. Again, back in the 80s and the 90s, there were people who did, there were documentaries made, and people went in and kind of clandestinely, stayed in overnight or did things. But no, since, 9/11, there is much more security in the sites, and they really don't allow people overnight anywhere anymore, especially if you're a tourist.
When you talk about the King's Chamber, what exactly is that?
The King's Chamber, in the Great Pyramid, there are three major chambers. One is the subterranean underground chamber, which goes down about 340 feet underground. That's called the Pit. It's kind of a rough-hewn chamber, which they say it wasn't completed. We don't really know, but it definitely is underground. Then there is the Queen's Chamber, which is the second area inside the Great Pyramid, which is a smaller room, and there was no queen buried in there. It's the Arabs gave it that name when they kind of broke open the pyramid to go in and inspect it, see if anything was left in there, and there wasn't anything there. That room is very much on a midpoint of the pyramid, and then the King's Chamber you approach through a stairwell that's called the Grand Gallery, and you ascend through the Grand Gallery to the top of the main chamber of the pyramid, which is called the King's Chamber. And that's the one that you see in pictures or documentaries or movies. That's completely, it's huge granite blocks of stone, and that has the sarcophagus, the open sarcophagus. And it's a completely empty chamber except for the granite sarcophagus and the walls. I mean, there's nothing in there. There was no writing, no jewelry, no artifacts, no mummies, no anything that would ever, have anything to do with a tomb. But again,
I'm getting visions of Indiana Jones movies.
Yes,
when he steals artifacts and.
Yes, all of Egypt is kind of like an Indiana Jones movie, and it's interesting because one of the things that does happen, aside from the metaphysical things, is you kind of go into this amazing, culture shock as soon as you get there, because you're just hit with a lot of different sights and sounds and smells, and everything's different. So it's a whole, your senses, kind of take it all in like a kaleidoscope, and then, the people who really seem to do the best are the ones who are not really so controlling or have to have everything, in a certain place or a certain way. When you travel anywhere in third world countries, whether it's Egypt or Peru or India, one of the things that you learn is to expect the unexpected and to become very flexible in your belief systems, because there's going to be, and we really have to have a good sense of humor, because there's something to laugh about like every second. It's just a lot of unpredictable things go on, especially when you live there. It's, really as a tourist, you're so protected, and you're so, things are made so easy for you. But living there, you really have to develop a sense of humor.
Well, when we get back from break, Mary, I want to find out why your tours are so special and what happens on your tours. And eventually, before our interview ends today, I want to find out how you connected your astrology. We haven't even talked about what is an Egyptologist yet. Let's do that in the next segment. My guest today is Mary Lamando. Her website is www.pachaterra.com, PACHATERRA.com. You can reach her by email at mlamando@bellsouth.net, or her phone number is 954-972-5891. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Be sure and visit our website at www.windowstowellness.com. www.windowstowellness.com. This is Linda Woods on Windows to Wellness. Our website is windowstowellness.com. I'm telling you, I'm learning a lot today about Egypt and why I would want to go there and what happens when Indiana Jones stole something and all the different hidden chambers and the spiritual experiences that one might have when one goes to Egypt. My guest today is Mary Lamondo. She is a teacher, a Jungian astrologer, and an Egyptologist. And Mary, can you just tell me how this all came together for you? You studied in London, and then you said there was a documentary on the pyramids that you went to in Egypt. And how many years later was that after London?
That was within the next 2 years. I actually went to Egypt between 1989 and 1990, and I started school just as the first Gulf War was ending. And how it came together was that, again, that idea of just being in Egypt, I suddenly realized that here was the mother lode of everything. It was putting everything together for me. The astrology, the Jungian, psychology, the study of the stars, the psyche, all of that, because the ancient Egyptian mystery schools taught all that. They just had different names for things, but they were the first explorers and healers and all of those good things that, we love. They were doing it all back then. Aromatherapy, brain surgery, you name it, they did it.
Brain surgery?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they've been able to ascertain through the forensic studies of some of the mummies that they actually did cranial surgery. So, plus if you ever watch any of the documentaries, the actual techniques of mummification are superb. And, we're talking 3,000, 4,000 years ago. So these things are, kind of putting it all in a, little neat ball is kind of hard to do, but it's more, it was just, I think you said it earlier, Linda, it was my destiny. I knew I was supposed to stay there. And when I first went there, I was lucky enough to be invited by certain people to work with different archaeology programs in Cairo and also in Luxor. So I was kind of a commuter. I had an apartment in Zamalek, which is kind of an upmarket residential area in downtown Cairo, where all the kind of British people and, people who work for embassies live. And then I also had a flat, which is an apartment in Luxor on the West Bank, which was about a stone's throw away from Deir el-Bahari, which is the temple of Queen Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut was just in the news lately in the past 2 weeks or so because the Egyptian archaeologists think that they have finally been able to identify her mummy after all these years. So, but that gave me a very different approach to Egypt because I was able to know families and I was able to have neighbors and people cooked for me. They invited me to their homes for their holidays, and I wasn't Muslim, but I took part in a lot of their feast days and holidays and festivities. I got to know their kids. I taught their kids English.
Well, you probably stood out you were in your 30s?
I was 37, and what was interesting was that most of the foreign women at that point in time who were there had Egyptian husbands. So it was kind of interesting because people would always try to fix me up with a relative, or they'd have an uncle or a brother or somebody that they wanted to marry off to the nice American lady.
So did you think you were going to fall in love in one of these temples or meet your soulmate when you walk through the door of a hidden room? Or
the sad story to that is no, I didn't. I was kind of like the boring researcher who I was in love with Egypt and the study of Egypt, and that kind of took me through lots of different adventures. Without telling tales out of school, I myself got into a couple of interesting things behind the scenes and was privy to lots of things that went on in terms of, let's just say, the politics of the time in terms of archaeology, that things that were going on there. But in and of itself, it was kind of like life was so rich and varied that relationships weren't really the main focus for me. That came later when I went to Peru, but that's another whole story.
Well, we're going to get to that. Don't think we're going to get around that one.
Right. I just, fell in love with Egyptian people. I mean, they're very warm-hearted and hospitable, and it's very like I'm Italian by lineage, and so it's very much like the Mediterranean, where people are just always really friendly and kind of inviting you to family dinners and things like that. To this day, I wish I had learned how to speak better Arabic, because that probably would have even gotten me closer to the more local, traditions and things. But at that point in time, I wasn't so much interested in the anthropology, which would be the study of local customs and, what the people themselves do. I was much more of the historian and looking into the ancient, mysteries.
Well, how did this all tie in with the astrology that you did and that you still do?
Yes, well, again, because the ancient Egyptians, everything that they did was based on stars and stellar patterns. The Egyptians and the Babylonians were the world's first astrologers. And so every temple and every monument in Egypt is aligned to a certain star or a particular time of the season, whether it's an equinox or a solstice. And if you stand at the Sphinx on the Giza Plateau, the Sphinx faces east, and there's many, many, many different references to the star alignment of Orion and Sirius. Sirius, the fixed star Sirius, was known to the ancient Egyptians as the goddess Isis, and the Orion configuration was known as Osiris, and Osiris and Isis were the mother and father of Egypt, so to speak. And so astrology, you just can't be in Egypt and get away from astrology, so it was a perfect fit. And I find that with many ancient cultures, the Egyptians aren't the only ones, but for instance, the Incas, the Mayans, the Indians, people who built sacred architecture were always astrologers and astronomers. Back in their time, they didn't differentiate between astronomy and astrology. It was all the same thing. You didn't differentiate between different forms of medicine. You were a healer. You were a physician. That was it. So we, in the Western technological age, have, segmented and fragmented all these different things. But back then, if you went to, let's say, an academy or a mystery school or whatever you were placed to study, you had to study many of these things, not just one at a time.
Now, what is an Egyptologist?
Well, an Egyptologist is different from an archaeologist. An archaeologist is someone who actually digs, and they bring out the artifacts, and you see them on TV dusting them off and putting them in the museum. What the Egyptologist does is study what the archaeologist digs out of the ground. So the Egyptologist is actually a historian, and my background is in art history and Near Eastern history, so that I could actually look at these things and say, oh, that's from the 18th dynasty, oh, that's from Old Kingdom 3rd dynasty, and differentiate, where somebody else is looking at it and saying, oh my goodness, these pots are just giving me a headache. Or, as some people, you hear people say sometimes who don't know what they're looking at and have just been, trotted around by some, guide who doesn't really know too much about what he's saying, they get templed out. It's kind of a phrase you hear. It's like, oh, I'm templed out, because you really need to give people a feel for what they're looking at, and that's my job. And
let's talk about what's different about your tours.
Well, again, having done everything, the length and breadth of Egypt for 4.5 years, and I could still spend the rest of my life there, no problem. What I do is I take out what I consider people don't want to see. A lot of tours take you basically to 2 or 3 things that are easy, and then shopping for the rest of the day, because it's an economy that really needs tourist dollars. So, that's kind of how they make it. And again, that's true in every third world country that you go to. But my tours, I design and specialize myself with one of the major tour agencies in the world that operates in Egypt, and I use a guide who's been, working with me for almost 12 years now. And we do what is considered a spiritual tour in the sense that we have private time and places where people have time to meditate, to kind of converse with the spiritual energy that's going on, and to just be left alone, which if you haven't been to Egypt, it's interesting because it's hard to find a quiet space. There's people all over.
Well, that's true here.
Oh, right. To carve out, that kind of time for people is something that I've really worked very hard to be able to do.
And how many people go on your tours?
I generally do very small tours, 10 to 15, 20 would probably be a max. Although in the past, I facilitated other people. In other words, I've had group leaders or teachers who wanted to come and, have me set it up for them. And then I've taken up the biggest tour I took was 100 people. And that was, 3 busloads full of people, and that was in 1999. I prefer to take small groups because it's more intimate and people really get a feel for, first of all, the group itself becomes a little bit more cohesive with their own energies, and then also just moving in and out of some of these places as a small group is much easier.
Mm-hmm. So is it mainly, I could never walk up a pyramid if my life depended on it. How do you...
Well, actually, Egypt's very easy to navigate because it's all flat. There's no mountains, and it's all sand, and you're definitely not walking up any mountains. The pyramid is something different, and what you do is there are steps to get up to it, and we do help people. Now, inside, there's hand railings, and it's kind of like the way a railroad track looks, a railroad tie, where you've got a wooden slat between 2 other beams, and then there's kind of there's a handrail, so that's what you climb up. It's very difficult to explain, but if you see pictures of it, it's easier to kind of get a grasp of it. Mm-hmm. It's something that if people have if they're physically challenged, if you have trouble breathing, or if your heart, obviously it's not stairs, it's more like a graduated ladder type thing, but it's flat. You're just climbing like a railroad track on an incline, and But anyway, having said that, if people feel like that's too strenuous, they just don't have to go.
Have you ever experienced anyone having a healing of any kind of physical ailment or any kind of a unusual event like that happen once inside?
I've had people have some very amazing psychic experiences and unusual heart-expanding experiences. I would not go the route and say that I've seen physical healing take place because I just wouldn't do that. But I have seen amazing changes take place in people psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually.
Can you give me an example?
Well, I've had people who have gone in and seen visions and become very much tuned in, let's say, to their own abilities, their own healing abilities. And they've written about it. I've had people come into that place and feel transformed physically because inside there's an energetic presence, and usually what we do is we tone or we do some kind of sound work, and so it actually works on the cellular DNA structure of your body. Now, to go on record and say I've seen people healed, I won't do that. However, I have seen people transform in that space. Do they hold it when they come out and go back to their everyday life in, Parsippany, New Jersey? I don't know because that's not my job. My job is to facilitate whatever takes place there in a very safe container so that nothing happens or nothing negative infiltrates their particular space. It's holding that container open for them.
Whoa, I'm ready to go. When we get back from break, Mary, I want to talk about Peru and how you met your husband and some of the trips coming up, when they are, and what people can expect and how they register for that. Your website is www.pachaterra.com, PACHATERRA.com. The email is mlamondo@bellsouth.net. We'll be right back.
Be sure and visit our website at www.windowstowellness.com. www.windowstowellness.com.
This is Linda Woods on Windows to Wellness, and our website is windowstowellness.com. And I was talking to our guest during the break, Mary Lamondo. She's a Jungian astrologer and Egyptologist. She's also a teacher, and she takes you on guided tours through both Egypt and Peru. And I'm always fascinated about how someone ends up doing something like that with their lives, and Mary's really told us how that all happened to her. But Mary, I'm still curious. You know, we're all searching to find our connection to, some people call it source energy, others call it God, others call it being enlightened, others call it living in a higher dimension. And there are those of us who meditate, and that's how we connect. And, you know, there are those of us who listen to channelings and get our inspiration through people who've already crossed over or beings who've never been here. But it's all about the other side, and people over there seem to be able to tell us things that can help us evolve. How does Egypt and the ancient sites and going to places like this compare to these other, that's all I've ever known, are those other methods. And I'm intrigued about, you know, I really am curious about your tours and what would happen, you know, what would that be so interesting?
It's a very, very, very interesting question, and a good one. And what I feel about Egypt, which is amazing, is that no matter what lineage you come from, whether you're a Buddhist or a Rosicrucian or a pagan or American Indian, whatever it is, there's something about coming to the energy that's contained in Egypt. If you're drawn to it, I mean, again, it's something that not everybody may need to do in this lifetime, but if you're drawn to it, it's something. Egypt is geared, the whole landscape, the whole grid of Egypt is connected to the stars. And there's a lot of impulsing. We talk about, people talking about the Mayan calendar and the photon belts and, all these different, phenomena that are approaching as the new age of Aquarius comes into being. And Egypt is gridded for that. I mean, the ancient star people who channeled to Egypt what needed to be done in these temples, that information still holds. And what I think is interesting is it's coded for the human body. There's a place in Luxor Temple where you can go and you can feel the whole, your body lights up, kind of like a Christmas tree.
Wow.
You just feel like cellular things just start happening. Mm-hmm. Inside the King's Chamber, you feel the sound really encoded in your body. So I think the difference with Egypt is that there's a cellular memory, there's an imprint that we all carry about really pushing the envelope on the human condition. We really are supposed to be more than a third-dimensional human being. And people talk about the light bodies. The Egyptians had a word for that. They called it the Sahu body. And the whole idea of being an initiate in the ancient Egyptian lineage was that you learned how to walk in your light body. It wasn't just about mummification and death. That was kind of like the outer trappings of it. But they were teaching how to walk in a light body. And when you go to Egypt, there are certain triggers in certain places. If you're open to it, and once again, it may not be everyone's cup of tea, but if you are open and you resonate, it starts to happen.
What do you tell people before they go into a chamber?
Well, we do some preparation work, definitely. And even before people come on the trip, there's work that I'm doing with them, either, via telephone like this or sending information or email or whatever, that they kind of have, and it's interesting, with my trips, people kind of get a calling to come. They're small trips, and I usually do not much advertising, and, it's not like the big, 60, 70, 80 people on American Express tours. Mm-hmm. These are people that are coming for a particular reason, and once you get them in the right space, so to speak, in the right spot, it's almost like popcorn. You just start going off like little kernels, and this is how the DNA cellular memory work. So whether it's coming as a channeling from outside, but you're feeling it in your body, or it's a past life memory that's coming, but you're feeling it in your body, or you're just kind of going along with the reverberations that are in the energies that are in particular spaces, it's there for you for as deep and as far as you want to go.
Well, do you tell people what could happen, or do you just let them experience?
I try not to set them up for anything to not happen. You know what I mean? It's almost like I'm there for people to talk to the whole time, the whole length and breadth of the trip, so that if things are going on and they want to have some feedback on what they're experiencing, that's what I do. That's why I'm there.
Okay.
But I don't go as a teacher and say, yes, we will go into this temple and you will feel this. That's much too controlling. I'm very Aquarian by nature, and it's like, I let you go in and kind of like feel the energy, and then if you want feedback, but I will give you the necessary backup of information. You know what I mean? It's like I won't let you go in there. I'm prepared. So we do teach about what the temples are all about during the trip and before the trip. But what you experience is your own personal experience.
When are your next trips?
Well, the next trip is scheduled October 19th, 2007. Then I have one during Thanksgiving, 2007. And then I'm doing one January 13th, 2008 with William Henry, who's also from Nashville, which is going to be a really interesting one. March 2008, the full moon equinox is March 21st. So that's going to be prime time to be in Egypt at the Great Pyramid. So mark that one on your calendar. March 21st, 2008, we'll be in Egypt at the Great Pyramid.
Okay. Let's talk about Peru and why you were drawn there and how you met your husband. And that's just a fascinating story, and we've got just a few minutes left, but I'd sure like for people to know about that.
Oh, sure. Well, yes. As I said, I wasn't really thinking of, leaving Egypt at all. But in 1994, a friend of mine invited me to go down to Peru to go to Machu Picchu. There was going to be a complete solar eclipse, which is visible down there from South America. So I did go down, and I knew as much about the Incas in Peru as you knew about Egypt before we started this conversation. The only thing I knew about it was that they had a place called Machu Picchu, and they had llamas, and she had convinced me that it was a very spiritual, esoteric place and that I should go. It took a lot of convincing to get me to leave Egypt, but I did go, and it was awesome. It just truly hit me. My heart chakra was just so totally open there in these gorgeous mountains, and Egypt is not about nature. Egypt is about the stars and about the grid of a very ancient planetary configuration that happens to be on this planet. Peru is all about nature, and it's very, 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 it's more indigenous, and it's much more like Native Americans, and the shamanism there is very much something that, is of the Americas. So, it's closer to home to us in a certain way. But I wasn't expecting to be blown away as much as I was, and there is where I met my husband, Omar Ali, who had just returned to Cusco he had been traveling and living in Europe and traveling throughout Europe and different parts of the world. In fact, he had just been to Egypt and Nepal before I met him. So we did have a lot to converse about when we first met. His experiences in Egypt weren't as good as mine because he didn't know the right people. But having said that, he was an artist, a musician. He was studying his lineage, which was Peruvian Andean shamanism, the healing of the, working with the nature spirits there. And we just had a lot in common. And so, again, I didn't intend to be married, but it felt like it was a soulmate experience. So I guess whatever, I was saving up for in Egypt, it just all, opened up in a beautiful way in Peru. And we decided to come back to the United States to do our teaching together and incorporate the two different systems, because there is very much a connection between the ancient Incas and South America and the ancient Egyptians. Edgar Cayce talks about it, and in fact, he says there's only 3 civilizations in the entire history of the planet that called themselves sons of the sun. First one was the Atlantean civilization. Second is Egyptians, and the third are the Incas. They all called themselves sons of the sun. They built pyramids, and they buried their dead in a particular way. We don't know why the Incas come out of South America full-blown from a cave up there at Lake Titicaca, and they know all of these precious formulas and information, and they're astronomers and astrologers, and they build amazing monuments. Some of their monuments look exactly like the stonework that you see in Egypt. So there is a mystery there, and I took it upon myself to learn that one as well. Kind of a cross-referencing in a lot of the work that I do between Egypt and Peru. So we'll be standing in one of the sun temples in the Giza Plateau, and I'll be talking about 5th Dynasty Egypt, and I'll say, oh, yeah, you see this over here? Well, when we're standing at Ollantaytambo in Peru, you're going to see the same, squiggly line here on this pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, do you lead tours to Peru also?
Yes, I do.
Mm-hmm.
Usually I go to Peru once a year in the fall, which is normally September, because that's, for me, it's the best weather. I live in Florida, and I lived in the desert for many years in Egypt. I don't really do cold weather all that well anymore. So September climate is really good in Peru, and that's when I like to go. However, Amaru goes to Peru 3 or 4 times a year. So
and does he lead the tours?
He leads the tours, and he does a shamanic journey through Peru. And basically, what he's doing is he's taking you to the sacred sites much the same way as I do in Egypt, and he's actually leading you through prayer and ceremony and connecting to the apus, which are the nature spirits there. In Egypt, we call them the netters, the divine ones. In Peru, they're called the apus, the nature spirit.
Well, you start out in London, you end up in Egypt, and you end up marrying a Peruvian shaman.
Yeah, he's in Peru right now. So I told him I was going to speak to you, so he sends his best.
Oh, yeah.
It's an interesting crossover, and one of the things that keeps it together is that the work is so, on one level, it's very broad, but it's also very cohesive, so that we each know what we need to do, and we're both teachers, so it kind of like interweaves. We blend those cosmologies. He's much more the healer and working with the physical energies, and my work is much more, in a sense, esoteric and a bit more etheric based. So we're a good team if anybody wants to go.
Was it love at first sight?
Yes, it was. And I think that was part of the attraction, was that I just was down there completely blown open with no expectations. So they always say that's when you get the best things in life come when you're not expecting them. So it was kind of like that. I never expected to find Peru as just as attractive as a country, just the beautiful scenery and all that, as I did, and I never expected to, find someone that would become such a caring partner, of my life down there as well. So you never know what's going to come around the corner.
I want to thank you so much, Mary. I'm just overwhelmed with this information, and it's just so intriguing how many different ways we can empower ourselves and become more enlightened and open up to new information. And I just want to thank you so much for sharing all this knowledge and your stories. And let me give out your website again. It's www.pachaterra.com, PACHATERRA.com. Phone number is 954-972-5891 if you'd like to call Mary to find out, or you can also find out about her up-and-coming tours on her website, and her email is mlamondo@bellsouth.net.
And I just want to interject really quickly that I also do private personal readings if anyone.
Oh, that's right. You do the intuitive astrology readings. So you do that while you're on tour or by phone or?
I do that all the time. Mostly I do it when I'm here, working from this country. But people who are on the trip and if they want a reading, there's nothing better than getting a reading in the middle of Cairo.
Thank you so much, Mary. I hope I see you on a trip real soon. I'm very intrigued. Maybe I'll even meet Indiana Jones. Who knows?
There you go.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Be sure and visit our website at www.windows2wellness.com. www.windows2wellness.com.